The Colosseum on Vareth Prime was the largest structure ever built by any species in the known galaxy. It rose from the red desert like a crown of black metal and glass, stretching so high that clouds sometimes drifted through its open roof. On this day, over 9 million beings filled its seats. Billions more watched from distant worlds through live broadcasts that reached every corner of civilized space. They had all come for the same reason, the right of champions. The right was not just a tournament, it was the only path to real power. Every 50 years, warriors from across the galaxy gathered here to fight. The winner earned their species a seat on the Conclave of Blades, the martial council that governed all matters of war and peace between star systems. A seat on the Conclave meant your species had a voice. Without it, you were nothing. You were ignored. You were furniture. Humanity had never held a seat. Cale Ashford stood in the long tunnel that led from the underground chambers to the arena floor. He was not a large man. He stood just under 6 feet, with lean muscle built from years of hard living rather than any proper training facility. His dark hair was cut short and practical. A thin scar ran from his left ear to his jaw. His armor was old, scarred plate from Earth's colonial military, patched in places with mismatched metal. He looked like what he was. A soldier from the losing side of a war that the galaxy had already forgotten. But it was the sword that drew attention. He carried it in a simple sheath on his back. When the tournament officials called him forward for the ceremonial weapon inspection, he drew it and placed it on the table. The blade was roughly 3 feet long, with a plasma edge that should have glowed bright blue along its cutting surface. Instead, the glow was dim and uneven. The metal was covered in deep scratches. A network of cracks ran through the flat of the blade like veins in a leaf. The handle was wrapped in old leather that had been replaced many times. The crossguard was slightly bent. The inspection officer, a tall insectoid creature with 4 arms, picked up the sword and turned it slowly. He looked at Cale with something that might have been pity. "This is your weapon?" he asked. "It is," Cale said. The officer placed it back on the table and marked his datapad. Behind him, the other champions were watching. There were 48 warriors in total, drawn from the most powerful species in the galaxy. The Gorvon had sent a massive insectoid fighter carrying an energy halberd that hummed with enough power to cut through starship armor. The Velisi champion carried a psionic blade that existed half in normal space and half in the dimension of thought. The Thalrek, a species made of liquid metal, needed no weapon at all. Its entire body was a weapon. And then there was Voreth Kine. The Draelith champion stood 7 feet tall, wrapped in living bioarmor that grew from his own body. His skin was pale gray, and his eyes burned a deep orange. He carried a resonance blade, a weapon that vibrated at a frequency that could break apart the molecular bonds of anything it touched. The Draelith Dominion had held a seat on the Conclave for over 3,000 years. Voreth had never lost a fight. He had never been cut. He was also the species that had conquered Cale's homeworld. Voreth walked over to the inspection table and looked down at Cale's sword. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was loud and deliberate, meant to be heard. He picked up the cracked blade without asking permission, held it up to the light, and turned to the other champions. "Look at this," he said, his deep voice carrying across the chamber. The humans sent a warrior with a broken toy. Laughter spread through the room. Not from everyone, some champions simply watched in silence, but enough to fill the space with the sound of mockery. The Gorvon clicked its mandibles in amusement. A pair of Keth warriors exchanged glances and shook their heads. Even some of the officials smiled behind their datapads. Voreth dropped the sword back on the table with a careless clang. He leaned down until his face was close to Cale's. "Go home, human," he said quietly, "before I break more than your sword." Cale picked up the blade. He slid it back into its sheath with a slow, careful motion. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. His face showed nothing at all. "I will see you in the final," Cale said. More laughter. Voreth shook his head and walked away, already dismissing the human from his thoughts. In the arena above, the crowd was reacting to the live feed of the weapon inspection. When Kale's sword appeared on the giant display screens, a wave of noise rolled through 9 million spectators. It was not cheering. It was amusement. A human commentator buried somewhere in the press section lowered his head and stared at his hands. The galaxy knew about humanity. They were a young species, barely 400 years into space travel. They had expanded too fast, colonized too far, and paid the price. The Draelith Dominion had crushed their outer colonies in a war that lasted 3 years. The Siege of Caldera was the only battle anyone remembered, and they remembered it the way people remember a natural disaster, with a mix of horror and sad fascination. 40,000 humans holding a mountain pass against 2 million Draelith soldiers. 11 days of fighting. No retreat. No surrender. Every single defender died, but the civilian transports escaped. The galaxy respected the sacrifice. They did not respect the species. Brave and doomed were words that often went together when aliens spoke about humans. Kale walked through the tunnel toward the arena floor. The roar of the crowd grew louder with each step. Light from the open sky poured in through the tunnel mouth ahead, turning the darkness into a bright rectangle of white. He paused just before the exit. His hand found the sword on his back. His fingers traced the cracks along the flat of the blade through the thin sheath material. He closed his eyes. He was standing in ashes again, a colony burning around him, bodies everywhere, smoke so thick he could barely breathe. And there in the rubble of a collapsed command center, a hand reaching up from the debris, his mother's hand, still gripping a cracked and battered sword. He had pulled it free from her fingers. He had held it against his chest like a child holding a blanket, and he had whispered into the smoke and ruin and silence, "I will finish what you started." Kale opened his eyes. He walked out into the light. The crowd roared, some in mockery, some in curiosity, most in indifference. He was just the human, the warm-up act, the easy first kill for whoever faced him. He stepped onto the sand of the arena floor and looked up at the 9 million faces staring down at him. He gripped the hilt of his damaged sword. None of them knew what they were looking at, not yet. The first round of the Rite of Champions was designed to remove the weak. 48 warriors entered. 24 would leave. The matches were chosen by lottery, and when Kale's name appeared on the board next to his first opponent, a ripple of excitement passed through the crowd, not because they expected a good fight, because they expected a quick death. His opponent was a Gorvon named Trex Valuer. The Gorvon were an insectoid species, 8 feet tall with 4 arms, an armored exoskeleton harder than most metals, and compound eyes that could track movement in every direction at once. Trex carried an energy halberd, a long-handled weapon with a glowing blade at its tip that could slice through reinforced steel like paper. He had won the right for the Gorvon twice before. He was considered one of the most dangerous fighters in the tournament. When Trex walked onto the arena floor, the crowd cheered. When Kale followed, they laughed. The size difference was almost comical. Trex towered over him, his 4 arms spreading wide in a display of dominance. His mandibles clicked in what passed for a Gorvon smile. "I will try to make it painless," Trex said, his translator buzzing at his throat. Kale drew his sword. The cracked blade caught the light, and the thin plasma edge flickered along its surface like a dying candle. The horn sounded. Trex lunged. The halberd swept in a wide arc meant to cut Kale in half at the waist. It was fast, blindingly fast for a creature that size. Any normal fighter would have been dead before they registered the movement. Kale was not there. He had moved before the swing began, not after, before, as if he had known where the blade would go. He slipped under the arc, stepped inside Trex's reach, and struck. The cracked sword found the thin gap between the second and third armor plates on Trex's lower left arm, a seam barely 2 inches wide. Trex screamed. Blue-green blood sprayed across the sand. The crowd went silent. Trek swung again, furious now, all four arms working in a whirlwind of strikes. The halberd carved glowing lines through the air. Any one of those hits would kill. Kale moved through them like water flowing around stones. Every step was precise. Every dodge was exactly enough, no more, no less. He did not waste a single movement. He struck again. Same technique, finding the gaps in the exoskeleton that even Gorvon warriors forgot they had. A cut behind the knee joint. A stab into the nerve cluster beneath the upper right shoulder. Trek staggered. His compound eyes were wide and confused. No one had ever read his body this well. No one had ever found his weaknesses this fast. 90 seconds after the horn sounded, Trek's valuer fell to his knees and yielded. He was bleeding from 4 precise wounds, none of them fatal, all of them perfectly placed to disable. The arena was quiet for a very long time. Then the murmuring began, 9 million voices trying to explain what they had just seen. Most settled on luck. A few were not so sure. Kale sheathed his sword and walked off the floor without looking back. No celebration, no display. He moved like a man doing a job. His second fight came 2 days later. The opponent was a Velasi named Sharn, a slender, graceful being with silver skin and pupilless white eyes. The Velasi were psychic, not in the weak, vague way some species claim to be. They could reach into another mind and fill it with raw terror. They could paralyze opponents with hallucinations so real that the body believed it was dying. In combat, Velasi duelists did not need to be physically strong. They simply broke their enemies from the inside. When the horn sounded, Sharn did not move toward Kale. She simply looked at him and pushed. Kale felt it immediately. A wave of cold fear crashed into his mind like a wall of black water. He saw himself dying. He saw himself burning alive on Caldera. He saw his mother's body broken and still. He saw every nightmare he had ever tried to bury. The fear was so intense that his legs locked. His vision blurred. Blood began to trickle from his nose. The crowd expected him to collapse. Every other non-psychic species that had faced a Velasi duelist had collapsed. Kale took a step forward. Sharn frowned. She pushed harder. The hallucinations intensified. Kale's body shook. His breath came in ragged gasps. Blood dripped from his nose onto the white sand, but his feet kept moving. One step, then another, then another. He was walking straight into the psychic assault, and he was not stopping. The crowd began to stir. Something was wrong. This was not how the fight was supposed to go. The human should have been on the ground screaming. Instead, he was advancing slowly, painfully, but advancing with the cracked sword raised and his teeth clenched so hard they might have cracked. Sharn's silver face showed something it had never shown in combat before, uncertainty. She was giving everything she had and the human was still coming. Not because he was immune, not because he was not afraid. He was clearly terrified. His body was shaking with it. But he was choosing to move forward anyway, through the fear, through the pain, through every horror she could pour into his skull. He closed the distance. Sharn tried to back away, but she was a psychic fighter. Her physical skills were not enough to match a blade fighter at close range. Kale pressed the edge of his sword against her throat, not cutting, just touching. "Yield," he said. His voice was rough and broken, and blood was still running from his nose. Sharn yielded. The crowd did not laugh this time. They did not cheer either. They simply watched in stunned silence as the human limped off the arena floor, wiping blood from his face with the back of his hand. The third fight was the hardest. His opponent was a Thalrek, a being made entirely of liquid metal that could reshape its body into any form it chose. Blades, shields, tentacles, spikes. The Thalrek could become anything in an instant. Cutting it was useless. Stabbing it was useless. The only way to defeat a Thalrek was to strike its core node, a small, dense sphere hidden somewhere inside its shifting body that served as its brain and heart. The fight lasted 11 minutes, the longest match in the tournament so far. Kale was hurt badly. The Thalrek landed a slashing blow across his ribs that cut through his armor and opened a deep wound. A tentacle strike dislocated his left shoulder. He hit the ground twice and got up both times. But he was learning. With every exchange, he read the Thalrek's patterns, how it shifted its mass, where the core node moved when it attacked versus when it defended. Halfway through the fight, Kale changed his grip on the sword. He shifted his stance to something no one in the audience recognized. It was low and compact, with the blade held reversed along his forearm. He waited for the Thalrek to overcommit on a thrust, sidestepped, and drove the cracked blade deep into the center of its body. The plasma edge found the core node with surgical accuracy. The Thalrek froze. Then it collapsed into a puddle of inert metal. The arena erupted, not in laughter, not in mockery, in something confused and electric, the sound of millions of beings realizing they had been wrong about something. In the fighter's tunnel below, Voreth Kine stood with his arms crossed, watching the replay on a screen. His orange eyes followed every movement Kale had made. The amusement was gone from his face. In its place was something harder and colder. Behind him, one of his Draelith handlers spoke up. "He is just a human. He will fall in the later rounds." Voreth said nothing. He watched Kale on the screen, limping, bleeding, clutching the cracked sword like it was the only thing keeping him alive. He watched the cracks in the blade. In the slow-motion replay, for just a fraction of a second, they seemed to glow. Voreth narrowed his eyes and walked away in silence. The night before the semifinals, the Colosseum was quiet. The crowds had gone to their hotels and ships. The arena floor had been swept clean of blood and sand. The only light came from the maintenance systems, a dim orange glow that made the massive structure feel like the inside of a sleeping giant. Kale sat alone in his quarters beneath the arena. The room was small and plain, a bed, a table, a wash basin. The organizers had given better rooms to the favored champions. Kale had not complained. He had slept in worse places. His ribs were wrapped in bandages. His left shoulder was back in its socket but still swollen and stiff. Dark bruises covered his arms and chest. He sat on the edge of the bed with the sword laid across his knees, running his fingers along the cracks in the blade, the way a blind man might read words on a page. The door chimed. He looked up but did not move. "Come in," he said. The door opened, and a Velasi woman stepped inside. She was tall and graceful, with the silver skin and white eyes common to her species, but she wore civilian clothes instead of armor. A press badge hung from her collar. She carried a small recording device in her hand. "My name is Shiara Vel," she said. "I am a historian and journalist for the Galactic Archive Network. I would like to speak with you if you are willing." Kale studied her for a moment. "You are Velasi. Your people's champion tried to break my mind 2 days ago." "She did," Shiara said calmly. "And you walked through it. That is one of the reasons I am here." He gestured to the single chair in the room. Shiara sat down and activated her recorder. The small blue light blinked steadily between them. "The galaxy is talking about you," Shiara said. 3 fights, 3 victories, all against opponents who should have destroyed you. The betting markets had your survival at less than 4% before the tournament began. Now you are in the semifinals." She paused. "Everyone wants to know how." "I'm a good fighter," Kale said. "You are a good fighter," Shiara agreed. "But that is not a complete answer, and we both know it. No one, not even the greatest warrior, reads alien physiology that well in real time. You found weaknesses in the Gorvan exoskeleton that their own species does not train against. You located the Thalrek core node in a shifting body of liquid metal without any scanning equipment. You knew exactly how to close distance against a Velasi psychic." She leaned forward slightly. "That is not instinct. That is knowledge. The question is where it comes from." Kale was quiet for a long time. His fingers continued to trace the cracks on the sword. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable. "If I tell you," he said at last, "I want you to broadcast it. Not now. Tomorrow during the semi-final. I want the galaxy to hear it while I am fighting." Shiara raised an eyebrow. Why during the fight? Because that is when it will matter. She hesitated, then nodded. Agreed. Kale lifted the sword from his knees and held it out. The dim light caught the web of cracks and scratches that covered the metal. Up close, the damage looked even worse, like the blade might shatter if he hit anything solid. This sword belonged to my mother, he said. General Marin Ashford. She commanded the defense at Caldera. Shiara's white eyes widened slightly. Even among aliens, the siege of Caldera was known. It was studied in military academies across the galaxy, not as a human victory, because it was not a victory, but as a case study in what happens when a species refuses to accept the math of a battle it cannot win. She died on the 11th day, Kale continued. His voice was steady, but his grip on the sword tightened. She held the main pass with 400 soldiers against a Draelith armored column. When the column broke through, she was still standing. The Draelith commander had to kill her personally because she would not fall. He turned the blade slowly. I found her in the rubble of the command center after the battle. She was still holding this sword. I was 14 years old. Shiara said nothing. She let him speak. But the sword was not just a weapon, Kale said. My mother knew that Caldera was the end. She knew humanity was losing the war. So she worked with the colony's science team on something, a project that had been running in secret for years. They called it the Archive. He held the blade up to the light. The cracks seemed to shift and move in the dim glow, like rivers seen from high above. Humanity has been fighting since the day we left Earth, he said. Every war, every battle, every skirmish, we kept records, not just written reports, detailed analysis, how each species fights, how they move, how they think, where their bodies are strong and where they are weak. 400 years of combat data against dozens of species, every loss, every wound, every lesson paid for in blood. He touched one of the deepest cracks with his thumb. The science team encoded all of it into this blade using experimental nanolattice technology. Every scratch, every crack, every imperfection in this metal is data. Combat patterns, physiological maps, tactical doctrine, the entire history of human warfare compressed into the molecular structure of the sword. Shiara stared at the blade. Her silver face had gone very still. When I hold the sword, Kale said, the nanolattice connects to my nervous system through the hilt. It feeds me information in real time, not words, not images, but instinct. Patterns. I feel where to strike the way you feel where to put your feet when you walk. The sword does not fight for me. It teaches me. It shows me what humanity learned from every enemy we ever faced. He lowered the blade back to his knees. Every crack you see is a battle we survived. Every scar is a species that tried to destroy us and taught us something instead. The galaxy looks at this sword and sees something broken. They see a relic from a dead war carried by a beaten species. He met Shiara's eyes. They are looking at 400 years of human survival. Every wound we ever took is in this blade. Every lesson. Every name of every soldier who died so that the next generation would know a little more, fight a little better, last a little longer. The recording device blinked silently in the space between them. Shiara realized her hands were shaking. She clasped them together in her lap. Why tell me this? She asked. You could have kept it secret, used the advantage in silence. Because this was never about advantage, Kale said. This was about being seen. Humanity has been dismissed by every species in this galaxy since the day we arrived. We are too young, too small, too weak. We lost our war, we lost our colonies, we lost our people. His jaw tightened. But we did not lose what we learned. We carried it with us. We put it in this sword, and tomorrow I am going to walk into that arena and show the entire galaxy what we carry. He looked down at the blade. My mother made this sword so that her death would mean something, so that Caldera would mean something, so that every human who ever fell in battle would mean something. The galaxy laughed at it. He paused. I want them to understand what they were laughing at. Shiara turned off the recorder. She sat in silence for a moment, processing what she had heard. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "the galaxy will understand." She stood and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back. "For what it is worth," she said, "I am sorry, about your mother, about Caldera, about all of it." Cale nodded once. "Do not be sorry," he said, "be watching." After she left, Cale sat alone in the dim room. He held the sword across his knees and closed his eyes. Somewhere deep in the metal, in the cracks and scars that covered the blade, he could feel them, faint echoes of every soldier who had contributed to the archive. Thousands of voices, thousands of lives, all compressed into a broken-looking sword that the galaxy had dismissed as trash. He ran his thumb along the deepest crack, the one that ran from the base of the blade to the tip. His mother's crack, made during the last stand on the 11th day. "One more fight to the final," he whispered. "Stay with me." The blade was cold and silent in his hands, but if he listened carefully, if he held very still and let the world go quiet, he could almost hear it hum. The Colosseum was full again, every seat taken, every standing space packed. The noise of 9 million voices blended into a single living sound that vibrated through the walls and floor like the heartbeat of some enormous creature. Above the arena, holographic displays floated in the air, showing the faces of the two semi-final combatants side by side. On the left, Orth and Jess, champion of the Keth Imperium, a species that had held their seat on the conclave of blades for over 10,000 years without interruption. Orthan was considered the finest swordsman of his generation, perhaps of any generation. He stood 7 feet tall, lean and precise, with dark blue skin and golden eyes that moved like a predator tracking prey. His weapon was a blade forged from compressed stellar matter, a sliver of a dying star, shaped and stabilized into the most devastating melee weapon in the known galaxy. It weighed almost nothing and cut through everything. On the right, Cale Ashford, human, carrying a cracked sword. The betting odds were not kind. Orthan was favored at 47-1. The only reason the odds were not higher was because of what Cale had done in the first 3 rounds. The galaxy had stopped laughing, but it had not started believing. In the press section, Shiara Vel sat with her recording equipment ready. Her broadcast was cued to go live the moment the fight began. She had spent the night editing Cale's words into a package that would play alongside the fight footage, the story of the sword, the archive, the truth behind the cracks. Billions of viewers would hear it while they watched. The horn sounded. Orthan moved first. He crossed the arena floor in 3 strides, impossibly fast for his size, and brought the stellar blade down in a vertical cut that split the air with a sound like tearing fabric. The sand beneath the strike exploded outward in a line 10 feet long. Cale was already gone. He had read the approach and rolled sideways, coming up with the cracked sword raised in a low guard. The 2 blades met once briefly, and the clash sent a shock wave through the arena floor. The crowd surged to its feet. Orthan pressed forward. His style was ancient and refined, 10,000 years of Keth martial tradition condensed into every movement. Each strike flowed into the next without pause or wasted energy. He fought the way a river flows, smooth, relentless, and impossible to stop. The stellar blade hummed through the air in arcs and thrusts that left glowing trails in the atmosphere. Cale blocked, dodged, and retreated. He could not match Orthan's speed. The Keth warrior was faster, stronger, and had a weapon that made the cracked sword look like a piece of scrap metal. Within the first minute, Orthan landed a cut across Cale's left arm that sliced through the armor and drew blood. 20 seconds later, a thrust caught Cale in the side, cracking 2 ribs beneath his chest plate. The crowd smelled blood. They began to chant Orthan's name. In the press section, Shiara triggered her broadcast. Across the galaxy, on billions of screens, her voice began to speak alongside the fight footage. "The sword the human carries is not what you think it is," she said. "It is not a broken weapon. It is a library." She told them about the archive, about the nanolattice encoded in every crack and scratch, about 400 years of human combat data, every war, every battle, every wound cataloged and compressed into the molecular structure of the blade. She told them about General Marin Ashford and the Siege of Caldera. She told them about a species that turned its losses into lessons and carried them forward in a sword the galaxy had dismissed as garbage. The effect was immediate. Across the Colosseum, spectators began checking their personal devices as the broadcast spread. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Confused looks turned to shock. Shock turned to something else, something harder to name. On the arena floor, Kale was losing. Orathan had opened another wound, a gash above Kale's right eye that poured blood down his face. The cracked sword was holding, but barely. Each impact sent vibrations through the blade that Kale could feel in his teeth. His body was failing. 3 previous fights had taken their toll. His shoulders still ached. His ribs screamed with every breath. Orathan pressed his advantage. A spinning strike caught Kale across the back and sent him stumbling forward. He hit the sand on one knee. The crowd roared. Orathan raised the stellar blade for a finishing strike. Then the sword changed. The cracks in the blade lit up, not the faint, barely visible glow from previous fights. This time, they burned bright lines of blue-white light racing across the metal like lightning frozen in steel. The entire weapon came alive with light, and the dim plasma edge that had flickered weakly throughout the tournament suddenly blazed with full power. Orathan hesitated, just for a heartbeat, but it was enough. Kale rose. His stance shifted, his feet moved to a position no one in the arena recognized. His grip on the sword changed. His entire body seemed to reorganize itself in an instant, like a machine clicking into a new gear. The way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he held the glowing blade, it was all different. He was not fighting like a human anymore. He was not fighting like any single species. He was fighting in a style that had never existed before, an amalgam of hundreds of combat doctrines from dozens of worlds, blended and evolved and refined into something entirely new. Human adaptability had taken the accumulated knowledge of every enemy humanity had ever faced and fused it into a single, fluid system of combat that belonged to no species and contained pieces of all of them. Orathan struck. Kale did not dodge this time. He redirected the stellar blade with a parry technique borrowed from Gorvon close combat doctrine, flowed into a counterattack using Velisi angular footwork, and finished with a strike aimed at a pressure point on the Keth body that the Keth themselves had forgotten was a weakness. It was a vulnerability from an era so ancient that it predated the current Keth fighting style by 8,000 years. Humanity had learned it from a battle fought centuries ago against a different Keth army, and the archive had remembered. Orathan barely blocked. His golden eyes widened. For the first time in the fight, he took a step backward. The crowd had gone completely silent. Shiara's broadcast was still playing. Her voice echoed through the Colosseum. Every crack is a battle they survived. Every scar is a lesson they refused to forget. Kale attacked. The glowing sword moved in patterns that shifted and changed with every strike, adapting, evolving, finding new weaknesses in Orathan's defense. The Keth champion was one of the greatest fighters in the galaxy, and he was being taken apart, not by brute force, not by superior technology, by knowledge, by 400 years of human suffering and learning compressed into a cracked blade. Orathan fought back with everything he had. The stellar blade carved through the air with devastating power. He landed another hit, a cut across Kale's thigh that nearly dropped him. But Kale adjusted instantly, shifting his weight to compensate, drawing on combat data from species that had fought with similar injuries and found ways to keep moving. The final exchange lasted 12 seconds. Kale closed the distance with a burst of speed that should have been impossible for a man with cracked ribs and a bleeding leg. He slipped under Orathan's guard, using a technique the archive had synthesized from 3 different species evasion patterns. The glowing blade found the gap between the Keth champion's arm and torso, a structural weakness in the ancient Keth fighting stance that no living Keth remembered. Orathan's golden eyes went wide. The stellar blade slipped from his fingers. He sank to his knees on the sand, one hand pressed against the wound in his side. He looked up at Kale with an expression that held no anger, only awe. "What are you?" he whispered. Kale stood over him, breathing hard, bleeding from half a dozen wounds. The cracked sword blazed with light in his hand. "I am what my people made me," he said. Orathan lowered his head. "I yield." The Colosseum did not erupt. The sound that came from 9 million beings was something lower and deeper, a wave of noise that was not celebration but recognition. Across the galaxy, billions of viewers sat in silence, watching the broadcast, processing what they had learned. In the fighter's tunnel, an elderly alien general, a veteran of 100 campaigns, turned to his aide. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what he had witnessed. "They did not build a weapon," he said. "They built a library, and they wrote it in scars." Deep in the tunnel behind him, Voreth Kine stood alone in the shadows. His orange eyes burned in the darkness. His hands were clenched at his sides. The Draelith champion had watched every second of the fight. He had seen the sword light up. He had seen the human dismantle 10,000 years of Keth martial tradition in under 4 minutes. He would face Kale in the final. And for the first time in his life, Voreth Kine was afraid. The final of the Rite of Champions was held at sunset. The sky above the open Colosseum turned deep orange and red, painting the arena floor in colors that looked like fire. 9 million spectators sat in absolute silence. No chanting, no cheering. The galaxy had spent the last 24 hours absorbing the truth about the human sword, and the mood had shifted from entertainment to something far more serious. This was no longer just a fight. It was a reckoning. On one side of the arena stood Voreth Kine. The Draelith champion had not spoken to anyone since the semi-final. He stood motionless, his bioarmor locked tight around his body like a second skin. The resonance blade hung at his side, humming at a frequency so low it made the sand vibrate near his feet. His orange eyes stared straight ahead, fixed on the tunnel mouth across the arena. On the other side, Kale Ashford emerged into the fading light. He looked terrible. The wounds from 4 previous fights had been treated but not healed. There had not been enough time. His left arm was bandaged from shoulder to wrist. Tape held his cracked ribs in place beneath his armor. The cut above his eye had been sealed, but the skin around it was swollen and dark. He walked with a visible limp from the gash on his thigh. But the sword was on his back, and his hand found the hilt as he stepped onto the sand. The horn sounded. Voreth did not waste time. He crossed the arena in 4 enormous strides, his bioarmor shifting and thickening as he moved, and brought the resonance blade down with enough force to crack stone. The vibrating edge screamed through the air. Kale blocked. The impact nearly drove him into the ground. His boots slid backward through the sand, carving deep trenches. The cracked sword caught the resonance blade and held, the nanolattice reinforcing the metal just enough to survive the molecular disruption. But the force traveled through Kale's arms and into his injured ribs. He felt something shift inside his chest and knew that at least one rib had broken completely. He twisted away and the sword separated. Voreth was already swinging again. The Draelith fought with controlled fury, every strike precise, every movement calculated but powered by a rage that had been building since he watched the semi-final. He had conquered Kale's homeworld. He had killed Kale's people. And now this human, this survivor from the ashes of a war the Draelith had already won, was standing in front of him in the most important arena in the galaxy, carrying a sword full of ghosts. The first 2 minutes were devastating. Voreth's resonance blade shattered Kale's left shoulder guard on a glancing blow. The vibration alone numbed Kale's arm. A follow-up strike caught the cracked sword at a bad angle and sent Kale spinning. He hit the sand hard, rolled, and barely got his blade up in time to deflect a downward thrust that would have pinned him to the ground. The sword's cracks were glowing, the blue-white light from the semi-final was back, and the archive was feeding Kale everything it had on Draelith combat doctrine. Attack patterns, defensive habits, preferred angles, known weaknesses in the bioarmor. Kale used all of it. He found openings and exploited them. He landed cuts on Vorath's arms and legs, slipping the plasma edge through gaps in the shifting bioarmor. But Vorath was not like the other champions. The Draelith bioarmor healed itself. Every wound Kale opened sealed shut within seconds, and Vorath hit harder than anything the archive had prepared him for. A backhand strike caught Kale across the chest and launched him 6 feet through the air. He landed on his back, gasping, tasting blood. The crowd held its breath. Kale got up. He always got up. But this time his legs were shaking. The sword's glow was flickering. The nanolattice had limits. It was old technology, experimental, never meant to sustain this level of output for this long. The archive was reaching its capacity. Vorath saw it. He pressed forward, hammering Kale with a relentless series of strikes that drove the human backward across the arena. Each block sent shock waves through Kale's broken body. Each dodge was slower than the last. Blood dripped from his nose, his mouth, the reopened cut above his eye. Vorath caught the cracked sword on his resonance blade and forced it down. He stepped in close, so close that Kale could see his own reflection in the Draelith's orange eyes, and spoke in a voice that only Kale could hear. "Your sword is dying," Vorath said. "Your body is broken, you have nothing left." He shoved Kale backward. The human stumbled, fell to one knee. The cracked sword's glow dimmed to almost nothing. The blue-white light in the cracks faded to a faint pulse, like a heartbeat slowing down. 9 million beings watched the human kneel on the bloody sand, and most of them believed it was over. Kale looked down at the sword in his hands, the blade that held 400 years of human memory, the blade his mother had died holding, the blade that had carried him through 4 impossible fights against enemies that should have destroyed him. The archive was fading. The data was still there, locked in the cracks and scars, but the nanolattice could no longer transmit it fast enough. The technology was failing. But Kale Ashford was not technology. He closed his eyes. He took one breath, then another. The pain was enormous, a wall of fire that covered every part of his body. His ribs were broken. His muscles were torn. His vision was blurring from blood loss and exhaustion. He stood up anyway. Not because the sword told him to. Not because the archive fed him some piece of data that showed him how. He stood up because he was human, and that was what humans did. They stood up. When the math said they should fall, when the odds said they should die, when every rational calculation in the universe said to stay down, they stood up. It was not logical. It was not strategic. It was the most human thing in the galaxy. Vorath charged. The resonance blade came in fast and hard, aimed at ending the fight in a single decisive blow. It was the perfect strike, angled to bypass any possible defense, powered by the full strength of a Draelith champion. Kale did not try to block it. He stepped into the strike. The resonance blade caught his left side, slicing through armor and flesh. The pain was beyond anything he had felt before, but the step put him inside Vorath's reach, closer than the Draelith expected, closer than any sane fighter would go against a resonance weapon. The cracked sword's glow surged one final time. Not from the nanolattice, the technology was spent. It glowed because 400 years of human defiance were concentrated in that blade, and in that moment, in the hands of a broken man who refused to fall, it was more than metal and data and memory. Kale drove the blade upward. The archive had identified the weakness months ago, a narrow gap where the bioarmor could not regenerate fast enough, located beneath the left arm where the natural armor plates met the synthetic ones. It was a flaw so small that no scanner could detect it, documented from a battle fought during the siege of Caldera itself, when Kale's mother had cut a Draelith officer in that exact spot before she died. But knowing the weakness was not enough. Reaching it required getting past the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy, taking a killing blow to get inside his guard, and striking with perfect accuracy while bleeding and broken and half-blind from pain. The archive could show him where to strike. Only a human could choose to pay the price. The cracked blade slid through the gap in Voreth's bioarmor and sank deep into the flesh beneath. Voreth froze. His orange eyes went wide. The resonance blade slipped from his fingers and hit the sand with a dead thud. He looked down at the sword buried in his side, then up at the human holding it. Kale's face was a mask of blood and pain. His body was shaking so badly he could barely stand, but his grip on the sword was iron. "That was for Caldera," he whispered. Voreth sank to his knees. He pressed one massive hand against the wound. His bioarmor tried to seal it, but the plasma edge had cut too deep. He looked up at the human standing over him, this small, broken, impossible creature, and the fury drained from his face. What replaced it was something older and quieter. "I yield," the Dralith champion said. Silence, absolute silence. 9 million beings and not a single sound. Then Kale raised the cracked sword above his head. The blade still glowed faintly, weakly, like embers refusing to die. Blood ran down his arm and dripped from the crossguard. He stood barely upright, held together by nothing but will. And he spoke, not shouting, not roaring, just speaking in a voice that the arena microphones carried to every corner of the Colosseum and every screen across the galaxy. "You looked at this blade and saw something broken. You looked at my species and saw something weak. But every crack in this sword is a battle we survived. Every scar is a lesson we refuse to forget. We are not mighty. We are not ancient. But we carry everything we have ever been, every loss, every wound, every war, and we keep walking forward. That is what it means to be human." The silence broke. It broke like a dam. The sound that poured out of the Colosseum was not the simple cheer of a sporting crowd. It was deeper than that. It was the sound of a galaxy adjusting its understanding of a species it had dismissed for 400 years. Some cheered. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. The Dralith delegation stared straight ahead with faces of stone. But others, the Velisi, the Thalrek, the Gorvon, dozens of species who had watched a wounded man walk through hell and refused to stop, they rose to their feet, and the sound they made shook the Colosseum to its foundations. Humanity was granted its seat on the conclave of blades. The sword was placed in the Galactic Archive, the greatest museum in civilized space, as the most significant human artifact ever catalogued. Scholars would study its nanolattice for decades. Warriors would debate Kale's fights for centuries. But at Kale's request, a single shard was removed from the blade before it was sealed behind glass. A small piece from the deepest crack, the one his mother had made on the last day of the siege of Caldera. He carried it home. 3 months after the Rite of Champions, Kale stood alone on the rebuilt colony world of Caldera. The pass where his mother had made her last stand had been turned into a memorial, a long wall of dark stone engraved with 40,000 names. At the center, a single marker bore the name Marin Ashford. The sky was gray and still. Wind moved through the pass the way it always had, the same wind that had carried the sounds of battle 11 years ago, the same wind that had scattered the ashes. Kale knelt beside his mother's marker. He pressed the shard of the sword into a small hollow that had been carved into the stone. The metal caught the light, and for just a moment, the faint glow of the nanolattice pulsed one last time before going still. He placed his hand flat against the cold stone. He closed his eyes, and in the silence of the pass, surrounded by 40,000 names, he whispered the last words he would ever speak to her. "We got the seat, Mom. They are not laughing anymore." The wind carried his words across the memorial, over the names and the stones and the memories. Somewhere far above, beyond the gray sky and the atmosphere and the darkness of space, A galaxy that had once dismissed humanity turned its eyes toward a small, stubborn species and saw them clearly for the first time. Scarred, cracked, broken in 100 places, and still standing.